Well, thanks Elodie, and thanks Sergei for the nice invitation. So I will have the pleasure to entertain you just after your rest. And I will be talking about something that is completely different from what you heard this morning. I will be talking a bit about natural language processing. And I will not be talking especially about my work, but I will be talking about a recent trend in natural language processing, which are attempts to deal with multiple languages at the same time in the same model. So I will first introduce a bit natural language processing. I guess most of you are familiar already with this discipline. I am taking this old definition by Gazdar just to mention that in natural language processing there are basically three main subfields. Initially the field was mostly about trying to describe properties of languages through computational means so as to be able to test or validate hypotheses about language. So the focus was mostly on language. There has been also a trend trying to relate properties of or our descriptions of language with what we know about the way the brain processes languages. But it's not so much what matters today. What matters today is really the third direction of research, which is basically about developing applications that handle natural language well. And this is applied NLP, as you know it probably today. And we have seen a lot of nice applications of NLP in the recent months. So basically NLP has been looking at mostly two kinds of problems. One is a problem of linguistic analysis. So you have on this slide a series of tasks or problems that we deal or that we used to deal with in the past. So the first problem would be, for instance, to take a speech wave, as you can see on the top of the figure, and to turn it into some kind of symbolic representation. In the process also chopping it into units that look like words, and maybe also identifying units that are not words, that are like hesitations or similar like that. So this is a very well-known, well-defined task, automatic speech transcription. And we have many tasks like that. So another task will be to take a sentence like this one and try to identify the syntactic structure that is not visible. I mean, when you look just at the word, so this is to identify relationship between the units in this sentence. Like we have a word that is the main word, we have a verb that is the main the main word of this sentence, and this verb has dependencies. It has a subject and it has an object, and we know that the subject is not the word that nearest to the verb. Maybe it's some word that can be as far away as the syntax allows. So we need to do this, and we need also to turn this representation into some kind of abstract graphs like this one, where we have like a semantic representation of what's going on in the scene. So we know that the scene, this sentence describes the action of se piquer off. So this is a French word, and this action has a subject, and the subject is an instance of a cousin. It has also an object, and the object is itself a proposition, and this proposition has a main verb, which itself has a subject, and it turns out that the subject of connaître, so the subject of this verb, is shared with the subject of cousin. So we have this kind of reentrancy property, which means that the structures we are after are eventually graphs. And also we need to do things like disambiguating this cousin. So is it a small boy or is it an insect? I mean, both are cousin in French, so we need to find out the right sense of it. So this is the kind of task linguistic analysis has been looking at for a number of years. And in parallel, NLP has also been looking at like more, as I said, more finalized applications. So this is an example of text of speech transcription, but there are many more listed on that screen. And in an abstract perspective, a lot of these tasks can be modeled, in fact, as tasks mapping strings of symbols. So I try to relate this with things that you may have been doing yourself in the past. So we are trying to map strings of symbols that we see ordered over some alphabet. So the alphabet can be, for instance, an alphabet of phoneme, or an alphabet of letter, or an alphabet of words, or even an alphabet of clauses, if we'd like to. And we'd like to map this into various output spaces. So the output space can be just a set of classes. So this is a simple classification task, but it can be also, we may want to map this sentence into this sequence into another sequence of the same length. So this will be sequence labeling, or we may want to do more complex tasks like find a graph for this sentence that would represent its semantic content. And this is difficult for many reasons. This is difficult because first, the boundaries in the input sequence are typically ambiguous themselves. The units we observe are massively ambiguous. So words have it's clear for words they have multiple meanings. And we have also an observed structural constraint, both in the input and the output space. So we don't observe, for instance, the underlying syntactic constraint. So this makes this problem difficult. And the last thing that makes this problem difficult is that we have also an internal structure over the alphabets. So the sets sigma are not just sets. Their content or their inventory is itself structured, and we don't observe this either. So this has made NLP difficult or interesting, if you want, for many, many years, and it means that it's not yet solved. For about 30 years, the community has slowly moved away from the symbolic or logic-based approach that was so popular in the 70s and 80s, and has embraced machine learning technologies. So it's been like 30 years now that we have tried to rely on annotated data sets like this one. So this is like a data set which allows you to train systems that would, for instance, assign for each word a part of speech, or assign for each word like a dependency structure. And we can learn this, and you know how to learn this with classification tools, or if you're more ambitious, with sequence learning tools. So this is well known, and this has been the state of the art for, as I said, almost 30 years. So came 2012, more or less, or maybe before this. We have been through two revolutions that, of course, you're well aware of. The first one has been to abandon words as symbols and to replace words as symbols with words as vectors, and using words as vectors, as it were, solved one of the problems I mentioned earlier, the fact that the sets of atoms we need to work with have an internal structure. So we have found ways, or the community has found ways, and in fact it was known long before this paper, that we could project atoms, our words, into large dimensional spaces with the result that, probably you cannot see this on this slide, I'm sorry, words that are related are close in the embedding space. So for the football lovers, so this is a query of the word Juventus. So, and here you cannot read, but I can read the closest neighbors to Juventus. And of course, these are also other football teams. And the first one is Marseille, so it's a well-chosen example for today. But there are other names, well-known names in that list. All right. And so one very important reason why these embeddings have been so popular in language is, as I said, they in an unsupervised fashion, they allow to uncover the internal structure of the lexicon we are using. So there are many ways to learn these embeddings. I am just listing the three more like common ways to use them. Most of them rely on simple tasks, on simple auxiliary tasks that we can train large neural nets to perform. And in the process of training these large neural nets, we will learn, in fact, these embeddings almost for free. So the most common way to train this model is to use mask language modeling, as probably you've seen a lot also in your field. Now, the ways to do it. One is mask language modeling, and I've seen that some people are using these techniques also here at scale. And there is a third one that is also very popular in language processing, is to use encoder-decoder architectures, where you will basically noise the input and try to reconstruct the output. And in the process of doing this, you can train the parameter of a language model that will, as a side effect, will give you the embedding representation. And this has been extremely popular and extremely useful. And in fact, adopting this has allowed the NLP community to make huge progress in like a couple of years. So this was already known, I guess, 20 years ago, but it's only starting 2018 and 2019 that we've been able to use these techniques at scale and get amazing improvements for all our tasks. So that many of the tasks that I mentioned earlier are considered as almost solved for a number of languages. So once you've trained your model, once you've your embeddings, there are many things you can do. First, you can fine-tune the system to do the task, any task you'd like to do. So for instance, you can do spam filtering. So you just train embeddings with these techniques that I mentioned, and then you can fine-tune a text classifier. With a small amount of annotated data, you will get extremely good results for all the classification tasks that I mentioned before. If you've used a causal LM when training theta, in fact, it has been found that you can almost solve all the NLP tasks using a simple technique called prompting or instruction learning. And for instance, if you're interested in sentiment analysis, so this is the third task, you just input a sentence and ask a question and get the answer yes or no to decide whether the sentence is a positive sentence or a negative sentence. So these models have been extremely successful. And they have been successful because, I mean, we are able to train these models at scale without any annotation. So this is good. We have a very large corpora for doing this with billions of words or tokens. We can fine-tune these models, or we can even fine-tune the prompt, or we can even learn the prompt. So there is a lot of things we can do with these prompts. And for high-resource languages, as I said, it has almost solved many of the tasks we've been fighting with for a large number of years. But of course, the size of the training data and the size of the model matter. The larger the training data, the better the model. So this is, I guess, more or less things that you already knew. What you maybe were not so well aware of is that there are other languages. There are languages other than English. Sorry. I don't know why you cannot see this slide. So there are languages other than English. There are many, in fact, languages other than English. Thousands of them. Most of them unwritten. And most of them concentrated in Africa, South America, Oceania. And for these languages, of course, we don't have all the resources we have for French, English, etc. And in fact, if you look at the distribution of resources across languages, you will realize that most languages are what we call low resource. So on this graph, on the x-axis, you have on the log scale the amount of data, unlabeled data you could use to train like word embeddings. Okay, and you can see, in fact, you cannot see, but most of the languages are on the x-axis, very here, and only a few number of them are in this region. Okay. More importantly, on the y-axis, you have the amount of annotated data that you can use to fine-tune the system. And there you can see that most languages, have no annotated data at all. And this is only for the languages we know of that have been studied. There are many languages for which we have absolutely nothing. And still, we would like to get technology. We would like to develop tools for these languages and these speakers, because these languages and these speakers are not negligible at all, and we need to study them if we want to better understand like the structure of the world languages, not just the structure of English. So just to illustrate languages in each of the clusters that you've seen on the previous slide. So of course the high resource languages, so cluster 5 is here, so containing the usual suspect, English, Spanish, German, Japanese, French. We have a lot of unlabeled data, and we have a lot of labeled data for these languages. And at the other extreme of the scale, these kind of languages, these are American languages, and also Icelandic is North Indian languages, etc. So for these languages, they still cover a large amount of the languages on the Earth, and also a large population of speakers. We have hardly nothing. We have hardly no data to train these systems. So the idea has been to move towards building multilingual systems. It's not such a bad idea because, I mean, there is a lot in common in our brains. So no matter the language we speak, we still use the same brain and we still use the same organs. So there are reasons, and there are also evolutionary reasons that suggest that maybe it would be useful to adopt like a shared view on all the world's languages. Still, when we look at languages, we observe at the surface a huge diversity. So a huge diversity of sound systems, a huge diversity of scripts, a huge diversity of structural organization as well. So this is exemplified by these trees. On the top, you have a French sentence, and in a French sentence, typically the subject would come first, and then the verb, then the object. So you would typically find the verb in the middle position of the sentence. And then the bottom part, it's an Arabic sentence, where typically you would find the verb at the initial position, then the subject, then the object. And we know that there are such variations across the world language. There are also variations that relate to the structure of words themselves that seem to make languages incredibly different. Nevertheless, as you can see on this snapshot of what I find on the Hugging Face Hub, a lot of people have been trying to develop multilingual models in NLP for a reason, for the purpose of trying to get annotated data that we get for high resource language helps the development of systems as well for low resource languages. So how is this done? How are these multilingual models learned? The first thing, of course, is to, as I mentioned already, is to develop multilingual lexical representation spaces. That is to get word embeddings that would span across all the possible languages. So to do this, we would also like to, again, have get the structure of the underlying space of all the possible words in all possible languages, so that words that are semantically similar, so maybe mutual translation, would be close in the embedding space. So the first condition to do this is to develop a way to represent all the scripts in all the languages, to develop a joint representation of all the scripts in all languages. So this is the way we do it. We do it with very simple tools that will basically, in an unsupervised way, chop any sequence of any character in any script with a shared set of units. So when we do this, you have to realize that we would just abandon the notion of word, abandon the notion of a morpheme. We just process sequences of bytes, and we chop them, and we have ways and techniques to identify a useful subset or useful subsequences that are repeated sometimes across languages and scripts. And we would use this as a basic input to our system, so simply a set of symbols, one symbol for each of these subsequences. Once we've done this, everything goes as usual. So we can use the same kind of machine learning techniques that we do for monolingual NLP. So we just input this, and we train either a system with masked language modeling or with encoder-decoder architecture. And we can also, if we like, add complementary terms in the loss so that we make sure that we exploit the fact that some words will be a translation to other words. We can, and if we know this for some pairs of words, we can also make sure that their embeddings are closed. And this has been done at scale, and in fact, it has been found to be extremely useful. Oh, it's funny. Sometimes they don't show. Extremely useful for a number of tasks. So one application I already mentioned is you can do prompting. So you can do prompting and get machine translation for free just by learning a multilingual system and have it generate with an instruction. So you just say, I mean, now everybody has played with GPT-3 or GPT-4 or ChatGPT, so this looks like a basic, but you can do this and have a very good machine translation system for free. And you can also do many other things. You can do fine-tuning in multiple languages. So you can, with the same representation, fine-tune a system for English or fine-tune a system for French. This has been done at scale. You can also do alignment, so cross-lingual alignment, again, for free. So this is a useful task in multilingual NLP, that is to align words that are mutual translation. And if you have multilingual embeddings, you can just try to find the maximal cost matching for this kind of bipartite graph, and you will get an alignment. And you can also do this to align sentences. And then, of course, you can do zero-shot transfer, like in this case, where you will train the system with English data, and you can test your system on any language that you'd like to test. And this is extremely useful. Think about all the cases where you would need to detect hate speech or dangerous speech in one language that you don't know, or for which you have no hate speech annotated data. You can just use these techniques and get hate speech detection in many languages for almost free. Again, an example of machine translation where you can see that using this system you can get a pretty good machine translation system. So not exactly what you would get with a dedicated architecture, but still very close to them. And I think they will keep progressing in the future. So I would not be surprised that this architecture would, in fact, overcome or supersede classical machine translation engine in the future. So now, why? And that's a big question. So this works. This works for hundreds of languages. So this works really for a wide diversity of languages, even across scripts. So languages that don't use the same alphabets, and for languages that don't use at all the same kind of syntactic patterns. So why does it work is the next big question, and it's a question I'd like to discuss for a few minutes. But before this, just to nevertheless mention some pitfalls of all these studies. Most of the studies I have mentioned before are pretty much English-centric. So this is the distribution of languages you get in your training data, if you look closely at what it contains. So one of the models is MT5, so you can see the proportion of English sentences in your training data. Compared to the other languages, so you can see that after the 10 languages, I mean, there is hardly any data for this language. This is another large language model, Bloom, that has been trained of 59 languages and also software computer languages. And you can see that English, even in that case, is still a third of the data is English text. Of course, before I continue, I need also to mention that when we design these models, we work with a preconception of what a language is. So we assume that we can identify English as a language, and we know that there are many varieties of English that we just count as one. But for some languages, I mean, the distinction or the separation is difficult to draw. So how many languages we count in our model is already difficult. So this model claims 104 languages. I don't know exactly the count. GPT-3 was assumed to be a monolingual, but I mean, after they looked at the data, they found many languages, or many sentences that were not English. So it's, before I move on, I mean, just realize that it's not so easy to count languages in these models. So now what linguists, or what people who are interested not only in scores or in performance figures, but also try to understand how this model works, there's been studies that try to really dig into the reason why this model were successful. So the first observation is that probably lexical overlap is not necessary. And this is something we did. I mean, it turns out that there are some languages that are very close but don't use the same script. And you take Hindi and Urdu, for instance. So they are very close. One uses the Arabic script and one uses the Hindi script. And in fact, I mean, in an unsupervised way, you would find out that these languages are really close, okay, even though they have no unit in common. So lexical overlap is not necessary. There are ways to break completely the system. So if you take French and reverse French, so process in the reverse order, you will not find them similar at all, even though they have exactly the same units and exactly the same distribution. So we know that if we reverse a language, we break any kind of similarity. We know that lexical alignment helps. So if we have a way to relate words in various languages, that will also help to get good representation. And we know that language typological similarity helps, so that languages that are known to be related historically are also likely to be close in these embedding spaces. So these are the reasons that have been identified that may explain why multilingual NLP is so successful, but it's not the end of the story, of course. There are also things that we don't know. We don't know the impact of language distribution. I mean, everything I've said was based on analysis where English was largely a dominant language. So all this remains to be confirmed or reanalyzed with other language distribution. We don't know exactly the impact of model sizes. So we don't know how to relate the size of a model and the number of languages it can handle. So again, we know that probably with more languages, we need to increase the capacity of the model, but in what proportion? Is it really needed? Or do we need at some part of the architecture to also compress or to introduce bottlenecks? And we don't know exactly which linguistic property will help or break the answer above the very simple cases I've mentioned earlier. Things we don't know again, we don't know how to generate code switch data. So it's a very well-known fact that in situation of language contact, people tend to switch freely between languages. Our models don't do this at all. So, I mean, still they are multilingual, but they don't do the same kind, they don't have the same kind of notion of multilinguality that actual multilingual speakers. So this is interesting. They don't know to answer questions cross-linguistically. So to do two things at the same time. And we don't know how well they could handle also like summarization from multilingual sources. So there are still many tests or many challenges that this model haven't passed, even though, I mean, they are improving every month or so. So I don't want to take more of your time. So these are like the messages I wanted to pass. Is that the NLP has been trying to embrace multilinguality with very simple tools, basically redoing with multilingual corpora what was known to work well with monolingual corpora, and this has been extremely effective. They learn linguistic features. I haven't discussed this, but this has been tested in many studies. They have like this amazing emerging behavior, like to cluster languages that are similar or related in a similar region of the embedding space. And they are useful in many applications. I won't mention this, but of course, nowadays, machine translation is mostly multilingual, so you would have one engine that would do the translation from hundreds of languages to hundreds of languages, and you can see why it's extremely cost effective because you don't have to train one system for each pair of language, but you can have one system handle tens of thousands of language pairs. And so for training and maintaining and deployment, it's so much efficient, and it's the same for parsing and for many other tasks of NLP. But still, they remain poorly understood, and I would like to draw your attention to the new questions, to the new linguistic questions that this model ask. How come that when you take data that is so heterogeneous, at the end you still get for free, translation for free, this kind of good clustering properties in the embedding space? We don't know that yet, and it's something that we certainly would like to explore more. And with this, I stop.
Thank you very much, François. I'm sure we'll have too many questions to be answered right now.
All right, so is this on? This meeting is about building bridges between communities and specifically between structural biologists and computer scientists. So I have actually two questions that I don't know. I mean, maybe even somebody from the audience could answer as well, but I'll try to direct them to you first. So in human languages, I understand the sequence of words is terribly important. In proteins, the sequence of letters that represent amino acids probably also important, but I'm not sure if to the same degree. So what do you think? That one question, and then the second is about the multiple languages. So I would, in general, expect kind of one language of protein encoding, but then I thought maybe, going along the evolution, maybe that was actually a little bit different. So maybe the early organisms would use slightly different language than humans, for example, but in evolution they could be kind of ordered in some sense, or not, or maybe this is just silly. I don't know. Okay.
No, the first question, I mean, I think it's clear that there are some linguistic universals. So first, the fact that we generate speech linearly, so that the order of words is so important in all languages. So this is certainly one of the helping factors that makes this model so successful. So even though we don't know, I mean, as I said, I mean, if you take a language and you shuffle words, you will immediately lose the similarity, even with the same words or the same distribution of units across the board. So it means that, I mean, there is a lot of information in the word order, and that this word information can propagate or make languages that in the surface are very different, yet they would look similar when you train a model that will abstract away the important structural properties that you find in the word order. So that's for sure. So word order is really a key factor in this. For the second question, I don't have the answer, so maybe I can turn to the audience because I'm not at all familiar with all this.
Are there more questions in the audience?
Thanks for a nice talk. I was just wondering about this reverse French thing. So why is that so different? When you use transformers to process this text, you would imagine that sort of the matches that it finds would be similar in the reverse as in the forward direction, because it does it sort of by matching keys So why is it that you? Wasn't that the example you gave, that reverse French was
Yeah, I mean,
different?
it's a fact that if you, I mean, there are still a notion of order in the transformers because you have the positional encodings. So that apart from this, I mean, it's difficult, but I mean, the similarities between sentences probably is much more obvious if you look at it in the right order than if you look at it in the reverse order. So that means the regularities of the pattern that you observe backwards are very different from what you would get if you observe forwards.
And so reverse French doesn't look like any other language on earth. It's
No, it doesn't it doesn't look like French either. So even though it would have exactly the same, as I said, the same units and the same distribution of units.
Yeah, no, because I mean, it is the only difference would be the positional
Yeah,
encoding,
yeah,
right? So
yeah,
that's why I was, okay, interesting. Thanks.
Thanks for your talk. I just have a question. I'm interested in explainable artificial intelligence, and we try to read into the models to see what they contain. They can explain us about what is modeled. And now we have these large language models, and now you mentioned that they are also multilingual, extracting common things. How far could we extract the structure they learned about the language in general, and how far that would be possible to have the universal grammar or universal language model that, I don't know, Chomsky and other people evoked many, many years ago? Thanks.
I don't have the answer to the second question. Obviously, I mean, the people have been trying to look at these embedding spaces and to see exactly what was the structure. I mean, one hypothesis is that if you have a very large model, you could have a subspace that contains French and a subspace that contains English and another one. And in fact, it's partly the case. And these subspaces are, by and large, homothetic somehow, so you could easily match one subspace to the other. So this has been studied, and it's we are getting better understanding or looking at these things. So this is one thing. And then the other thing that we've been doing, and that's why I mentioned here, we've been doing a lot of probing experiments. So you take like word embeddings, and you try to see from the embeddings you can decide whether it's a verb or a noun, or what kind of linguistic property it has. Or you take two embeddings and you see whether they can define whether they have whether they are syntactically related. Okay, so and in fact it has been shown that a lot of linguistic information is contained in these embeddings. So just looking at this contextualized embedding, there is a lot you could do, and there is a lot of questions you can answer about, like so you can build parser mostly using these embeddings. On trying to ask whether two words are related, and doing this for all the pairs of words, you would get graphs that would be, by and large, very good predictors of the syntactic structure. So in fact, there is a lot of linguistic information in these embeddings, even though it's difficult to relate this to any like symbolic notion of a grammar or something like that that would, that you could explain, or you could. So a lot of analysis has been done to try to look at what these embeddings are containing or what they have learned, but so far I would disappoint you if but we don't have like a good theory of like linguistic universals that could explain why this is the case.
So yeah, it's fascinating that you can learn without so little information these embeddings that basically tell you what each word means in another language. Could it be that there is somehow text that is, for example, translated, that slips in and that basically helps you like a Rosetta Stone? And because imagine if you have just a few words that you can translate from one language to the other, basically you can expand from there on and make that set larger and larger. That gives you, clear assignments between the embeddings. Or it could be just proper names, for example. This example you gave, Juventus, always appears with certain verbs that have to do with football or soccer, and then advancing from there, you can basically discover a lot of correspondences without having actual knowledge about them beforehand.
No, that's a very good question. I mean, in fact, it has been found that text, no matter how different scripts they use, they will contain symbols that are the same, like numbers, and sometimes proper names, and sometimes punctuations as well. So these things help a lot. But as I said, you can still get like good language similarity without any lexical overlap. So lexical overlap like is probably a facilitating factor. We don't know how much. We know that if we add like constraint or if we add lost terms in our learning, that will force like parallel sentences to be close. That will help as well. But still, there is a lot of learning that happens without this. So this is like helping, but it is not the explanation.
We have to move on, unfortunately, because someone is waiting for us on Zoom.
All right, so thanks a lot.
Thank you, François.